What I'd like to share with you today is a story that really kind of cuts across that sense of where our food comes from, the role of novel, world-beating science, and also the role of the entrepreneur being utterly critical to us being able to sustainably close yield gaps and feed our hungry planet. I also want to convince you by the end of my talk that another next great revolution in ag is just around the corner. So we'll go straight to the start of this story. That's me. I'm the one on the left. It's not a spot the difference competition. It's a bit early in the day for that. But what you can see is that I was always interested in horticulture. And although any of you familiar with the English climate will know that we do not excel in growing oranges, but what we do have are my uncle's prize-winning pumpkins. Probably, if that one there was next to us, it'd probably be sort of this big off the ground. And he used to grow these things on his allotment. This is an artist's impression of what his allotment might have looked like. My Polaroid had probably run out of pictures at that point. But I used to go down there with him all the time, and you'd see this food growing, and it would just be like, wow, how can you do this? And these pumpkins in particular, he'd win these prizes. And it just felt like magic to me at that age. But apart from staring at my uncle's pumpkins, well, not quite sure what I meant by that, I also used to pester him with these questions, about the sky at night and the universe. How many stars are there up there? Good questions for a landscape gardener by trade. And, if you fast forward another 10 years to when I'd started to become a scientist, and I was still staring at the sky, but now I was involved in understanding the consequences of stratospheric ozone depletion. And there was a huge effort. I'm sure everyone from New Zealand would understand the story there, the headlines of the story. Depleted ozone, you can see it there on the screen. This is still happening every year, this condensing of ozone-depleted air over Antarctica in the southern hemispheric spring. And this led to a frenzy of activity, back in the 1980s and 1990s. And we were able to deal with ozone depletion. We managed to chuck out CFCs via the inauguration of essentially still the most successful climate treaty that's ever been signed in terms of a global catastrophe that was beckoning, which was the Montreal Protocol. So CFCs went mostly, and we're now seeing a decline in depletion. But people like me who were plant scientists were actually trying to understand, well, if there was going to be more UV poking through, what was that going to do to crops and plants? And so we wanted to understand that. And out of this work, we thought we would be figuring out, well, what's bad about UV? How is it hurting plants? But actually, as we started to do that work, we came up with a different question, kind of the opposite question, which is actually how can plants in places like New Zealand survive perfectly well and be productive in a high UV environment? We know New Zealand has high UV. It's actually got less to do with ozone depletion than people think. It will always be, quite a high UV environment here in New Zealand. But for those of us who are trying to figure this out, it was like, well, why is that happening? How can plants have an armor to be able to defend themselves against UV? And to answer that question, we actually have to go back a bit further, maybe 400 to 600 million years ago, when plants were first evolving onto the land, the plants that we recognize today. Unlike this one here, again, an impression of an extinct plant called Cooksonia, which doesn't really resemble a plant. But as plants made this journey onto the land, they had to be able to cope with the challenges that were facing them. One of those was desiccation or drought, and the other was high UV, because 400 to 600 million years ago, we either had no ozone layer or a very embryonic one. So plants were being bombarded with UV. And to be able to get around that, they started to develop or evolve mechanisms within themselves to cope. So they developed signaling pathways. There is a protein in all plants on Earth today which probably comes from those first evolutionary steps, which works kind of similar to a human eye, allows the plant to see UV coming and be able to trigger that signaling response inside it. And then as evolution continued, we start to see plants that resemble a little bit more like we recognize today. Only now the mechanisms of UV protection were advancing, so they had pigments in their leaves so they could protect themselves. They were changing the growth of their leaves and their shape. So there was this armory of UV defense and signaling that was building up over time. You're entitled to ask at this point, well, that's all great, interesting, but what does that mean for food? What does that mean for agriculture? And if we can understand more of how a plant communicates with itself, what it's actually doing in response to its environment, then we can find ways to potentially exploit that in agriculture and to be able to deal with some of the huge challenges that face us in agriculture at the moment. But bad news that we're all kind of familiar with already is that the pace of agri-innovation is not moving fast enough to be able to keep those yields going where we need them to be for our future needs. And this is one of many examples I could have picked on. It's a graph of essentially the global average scorecard for soybean yield in tons per hectare. And you can see how since the 1960s, we've had this steady increase in yield. We've had innovations like biotechnology in the last 20, 30 years. We've had fertilizer availability, chem sprays, and we've achieved a great deal in that time. But to be able to go to where we need to go to by the middle of the century, we need to actually elevate that slope, that curve of improvement. But we have got a problem. We're not going to make it. This is where we're heading at the moment, which is going to fall well short of the needs of a crop like soybean and probably any other major crop that you'd pick on for a comparison. So why are we going to fall short? Obviously, it's complicated. Everybody in this room knows some of those reasons. But one of the reasons is that some of the innovations that came out of the Green Revolution, nutrient sprays and GM, some of those tools are very expensive and time-consuming to produce. And they're also very physical. You know, they're being applied to the plant. The plant isn't taking care of business on its own. I've got two examples here for you. One is the time and cost to develop a single GM trait. So this would be a gene that would be inserted into a plant, would give that plant herbicide tolerance, for example. And also the other example, these are industry figures, by the way, is a crop protection product, like a chem spray. But here we're talking on these numbers anywhere from 11 to 13 years to do the discovery science, to test, to trial, to commercialize, to get through the enormous regulatory barriers that exist for chem and for GM, to get those out into people's hands. And we're talking anywhere up to 300 million US for a single endeavor in that journey. So what are we going to do about that? You know, we have these products with us. They're here to stay. This is not a no to GM discussion. We need these products and tools, but we also need other innovations too if we want to get that slope of the curve back on track. And you know, for somebody in my place working with light, the question really is, well, what can we do with the plant? Can we program plants? Can we give them instructions to do things themselves, as opposed to applying a heavy spray or relying on that, and the same with a physical manipulation like GM? Can we program plants to do things for us? And we now know that this is possible because plants and seeds are just like mini computers, really. They have software, they receive messages, we can give them messages through the environment they're in and other applications. And so we know that plant signaling is there to potentially be controlled. And this is a huge new area in plant science that relates to agriculture. How can we manipulate that plant signaling? And that plant signaling is really sophisticated and pretty magical. This is an example of plant signaling in action. So what you're looking at is a top-down view of a plant through the lens of a fluorescence imager. And what's happened on the right is that a wound has been made to that plant leaf, and then a signaling molecule has been applied to that wound site. So this is supposed to mimic what happens when an insect lands on a leaf and chews it. And what you can see when the signal is initiated is that that path of signaling moves right across the plant. It goes up and down the leaves. If you could see the roots, it would also be going down to the roots. And the plant is saying to itself, something's happening over here, we've got to start doing some stuff. And then it will start to try to defend itself against what it's perceiving as a stress or an attack. So it is pretty magical, really. We were talking about light and plants earlier on in this story, and this is probably the diagram that most people in the room would be familiar with, probably the one that put them off wanting to learn more about plants at school. But what you see is the role of light in photosynthesis, providing energy, 3 yellow bars, nice and simple, energy for the plant to then be able to make its own energy. But light is far, far, far more than 3 yellow arrows on a diagram. If you actually start to break light down and then relate that to what plants can see, the possibilities are enormous. This is an overview of what we see in sunlight. So you've got the UV region, the visible, and the infrared. And plants can see all of these different colors. Plants can also see things in combination. So it's not just about a particular kind of color, but a mixture, like an artist's palette. I don't know if anybody stayed up late last night trying to find out how many color combinations possibly exist in the world. I didn't. I probably wouldn't recommend it. But one of the estimates is 18 decillion colors. So what's that? That's the number 18 with 33 zeros after it, which is crazy. And it's probably going to make it harder to pick out the wallpaper next time as well. But what we also now know with the ability of plants to see light, for us to be able to send these messages and control them, is that we can develop light signals. We can develop a pattern of light which we can give to a plant, which will control things inside it, which could give us huge gains in terms of crop production. What kind of things are we talking about? Hopefully this is the only slide where some of you are going to be thinking, well, what the hell's that? Well, apart from the baby photo. But this is a snippet of a biochemical pathway in a plant. So plants are doing this and other things beside. They're making compounds. There's enzymes involved to catalyze the conversion of different reactions. But they're doing all these jobs. But what we also now know is that light signal patterns could be applied kind of like a light switch, but a very complicated one. And we can actually control different parts of the system. So we can do things we do want to do and not trigger responses that we don't want to see. This then paves the way for us to develop light signals as a way to actually change the future lives of crops for the better. Next question would be, well, what does that really mean? What are the headlines of improving crops with light? We're talking about increasing crop yields, boosting a plant's own ability to increase its yield. We're talking about giving a plant instructions to defend itself better against a pest that might be chewing on its leaves. The same is true for a disease. So we can give a plant an instruction to try and defend itself against disease as well. Diseases like Pseudomonas syringae, PSA. We can induce color change, taste. We can control shelf life and give a plant a more added commercial boost for when it hits the shelves and it's able to withstand the rigors of the supply chain. And we can also control the production of plant-based medicines. But this is all really just the tip of the iceberg of what we might be able to achieve with a light signal recipe. When I was talking about my walks with my uncle earlier on, pestering him about the sky at night, how many stars are there out there, etc. And there are some obvious parallels here with what I've just said about light. There are billions and billions of combinations of light signals that plants may be able to see. And a mission for us in this space is, well, how can we understand that? How can we control that? We can't do 18 decillion experiments in the lab, although perhaps sometimes it feels like that's what scientists are doing. But we need to control this in another way by using data science, using molecular biology and other things that can help us understand where the good light signal recipes lie for us. And our solution has been to build a startup company where the pace and the focus of doing so gives us some chance of being able to untap some of those secrets of light signal recipes. So BioLumic is a biotechnology company based in Palmerston North, New Zealand. And our mission is to develop these light signal recipes. And we do that in quite a different way to what people might think. You know, we don't dangle lights over plants and leave them there for the whole of the growing cycle. We deploy the light strategically, like a little treatment, like an inoculation when you're a kid. So you deploy the treatment early in the plant's life, and then that's it. And then we look to look for those upsides that I talked about earlier. We do this in two main ways. We treat young plants before they go through the rest of their life cycle. Like these strawberry runners. So we treat them for just a week of a light inoculation recipe, and then they go into the rest of the growth cycle, and we don't touch them again. The other thing we do is treat seeds prior to sowing, which obviously has enormous possibilities because not all crops are conducive to being grown in a controlled environment. They're going straight out into a direct drill into the field. Like these soybean plants here in one of our labs in California. So we treat the seed, sow the seed, and that's it. And then we look for those upsides of triggering those responses in plants that we think are valuable to us. We were talking about the sustainability agenda earlier, and a reasonable question to ask is, well, what's sustainable about a light signal recipe? it's light at the end of the day. It's not a chemical spray. It's not a physical insertion. It's something that is standalone and is reflecting on the plant's own ability to trigger the upsides. Also, because we deploy our light signal recipes in this strategic, quick way, it means that we're not dangling energy-consuming lights over a plant for its entire life, and may be able to make the growing of plants under other lights more efficient and get more out of that electricity bill. Also, we've learned through some of the testing we've been doing in different places around the world that we can also induce plants to be more nutrient use efficient with a light signal recipe. So we can make them deal with the nutrients they are being fed in a much more efficient way. If you think back to my uncle's pumpkin and how I used to go down to the allotment, and it was like, well, how are these so big? In the end, I did sort of unravel the mysteries, which was that he had a massive trough at the end of the allotment that was just full of nutrient mix. And, he's trying to get the certificate, bring the prize home, just ramming nutrients into these pumpkins, and they blow up like a balloon. And so we did solve that mystery, but for what we're doing at BioLumic, the option to actually control nutrient use efficiency is there for the taking. So I've talked a big game so far. We can do anything with light signal recipes, but what's the evidence look like? What does the data look like? And I've got just a couple of examples to show you, although there are many more that are now starting to rise up. The first one is cannabis yield. So the expensive part of the cannabis plant is the flower, just in case there's anyone in the audience who wants to pretend that they do not know that. And yeah, it was a college thing, right? Yeah. What you can see here, though, is where we took a light treatment we developed at BioLumic. We gave it to the young cannabis clones before they were grown on, and then allowed them to go through the rest of their life cycle. When it comes to harvest, we had a 32% increase in final flower yield per plant. And we've repeated this many times. And now we're understanding the molecular biology of what actually triggers that, which of course helps us exploit it even more. And then the other example I've got is with pest attack. So this is soybean. So we took soybean seeds, treated them with a light recipe we developed, sowed the seeds, grew the plants, and then when they got to about 1 meter tall, we deliberately inflicted insect feeding attack on the plants, measured how much was being eaten of those plants. And with the BioLumic treatment to the seed prior to growing on, we halved the amount of damage that was done by the insect pests. And these are not silver bullets, but if you can halve something, then you can find a way of maybe increasing that benefit, and you can also then condition the other physical things you need to do to that crop and manage things in a more sustainable way. So if we think about the big picture with light signal recipes, what if we could apply light signal recipe to every crop on Earth? What kind of things could we be achieving? And they map pretty well to what we're trying to do with the sustainability agenda. We can increase a plant's ability to withstand climatic turbulence. There is no such thing as a normal season anymore, and we can help plants to maybe navigate that in a better way. We can give that pest and disease self-protection that I talked about. We can increase yields. We can increase nutrient use efficiency. We can maximize phytonutrients, so we can farm crops for particular properties that we're looking for, color, taste, etc. We can also exploit those medical properties. We're working extensively in cannabis at the moment with one of New Zealand's medical cannabis companies and others overseas. We can reduce those chemical inputs that I talked about earlier, not a silver bullet, but it could help us reduce those amounts. And then we could also leverage the use of other ag innovations, like microbial coatings. We could allow those to take better, or we could boost the efficiency of vertical farming costs and so on. We are entering another great revolution in ag at the moment, one that's going to be marked by the sustainability agenda and also this outside-of-the-box thinking, a little bit like our light recipes. But that outside-of-the-box thinking has to also translate to how we innovate, not just what we innovate. We need, in my view, 1 million startup companies working in this space at a speed that others in the equation just simply cannot. And that's part of the recipe as to how we'll be able to sustainably feed our hungry planet. Thank you very much for listening, and kia ora.